You know, usually when we look at the dashboard of a car, there's this like underlying expectation of total precision.
Oh, yeah, completely. You just trust it.
Right. You're driving down the highway, the speedometer says 65, the fuel gauge reads exactly half full, the engine temperature is, resting perfectly in the middle.
Yeah, it's binary. It's objective. And honestly, it's really comforting.
It is. We are entirely wired to like things that are visible, things that
Mm.
can be neatly categorized,
Hmm.
quantified, and accurately measured.
Right, because we rely on those instruments to tell us the absolute truth about our journey.
Exactly. But then, you step out of the car and you step into the world of modern economics. You step into global policy, labor markets, cultural shifts.
And that's where the dashboard completely breaks down.
Right. Suddenly, that societal dashboard we are all looking at is just flashing all the wrong signals. I
Sure.
mean, the gauges maintained by the institutions and the elite systems, they're telling us one thing.
Like the stock market is soaring. Technology is revolutionizing our lives.
Yeah, exactly. GDP is growing. But the engine, the actual lived experience of the average person on the ground, it sounds like it is actively falling apart.
It's the absolute definition of flying blind.
Yeah.
While the air traffic controller is just insisting everything is perfectly fine.
Yeah, the dials are spinning, but the reality on the ground tells a completely different story. So, welcome to the Morning Roundup.
Glad to be here for it.
This is our daily deep dive into a massive stack of sources. Today, we're looking at economic white papers, geopolitical dispatches, demographic surveys, and even some deep historical and theological analysis. It's a huge stack today. It really is. And our mission today is to cut right through the noise. We are looking squarely at the glaring gap between the top-down narratives we're fed by elites and the raw, uncomfortable realities happening from the bottom up.
We're talking global protests, economic strain, and, frankly, the staggering mental health data of our youth.
Yep. So, a quick reminder to you, our listener, before we jump in, make sure to like, subscribe, and share the show. Our goal today is just to present the facts, make the connections, and let you decide how you feel about it.
And to understand any of this, we really first have to understand the mechanics of how reality is presented to us, right?
Right.
We have to examine how doubt is manufactured and how consensus is, well, effectively bought.
Which brings us to the AI industry. I was reading through this economic analysis provided by MIT's Daron Exmoglu, and my jaw just hit the floor.
Oh, the co-paradigm paper.
Yeah. He's looking at the current rollout of artificial intelligence, and he argues that the major AI players are currently running a playbook called the co-paradigm.
It is a brilliant and honestly somewhat chilling historical parallel.
Let's break that down. What exactly is the co-paradigm?
So it's essentially a blueprint for narrative control. It's named after Robert Kehoe, who was a toxicologist instrumental in the mid-20th century. To understand what AI companies are doing right now, we actually have to look at what the lead industry, big tobacco, and big sugar did decades ago.
Right, because, when I think of big tobacco in the 1950s, I think of them just flat out lying.
Most people do.
But Esimoglu points out that their strategy was actually much more sophisticated than simple denial. They didn't just suppress the science, they weaponized it.
Exactly. Let's look at the actual mechanics of it. When early epidemiological studies started linking cigarette smoking to lung cancer, tobacco executives realized they couldn't just say, no, it doesn't.
Because no one would believe them. It lacks credibility.
Right. So what did they do? In the early 1950s, they created something called the Tobacco Industry Research Committee.
That sounds very official.
Right. And they didn't hire PR hacks to run it. They hired Dr. C.C. Little, a highly respected Harvard-trained geneticist. And then they funneled millions of dollars in grants to researchers at major universities.
Wait, so they basically just bought the intellectuals?
They bought the framing. By funding massive amounts of adjacent research, they compiled lists of credentialed doctors and scientists who, for various reasons, questioned the direct causal link to cancer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then the industry would feed those specific names to journalists who were, just looking for a balanced story.
So they created this illusion that the scientific community was deeply divided, that there was no real consensus yet.
Exactly. Their mantra was always, we just need more data.
Mm-hmm.
It paralyzed regulation and kept people smoking. I mean, cigarette consumption didn't even peak until roughly a decade later in 1963.
That is wild, and Big Sugar ran the exact same play in the late 60s, right?
They did. The sugar industry literally paid Harvard nutrition scientists to publish a massive literature review in the New England Journal of Medicine.
To what end? What was the goal?
The goal was to aggressively shift the blame for coronary heart disease away from sugar and pin it entirely on saturated fat.
And it worked. It successfully altered the American diet for 50 years.
Exactly.
Okay, so map this onto today for me. Asomoglu is arguing that the major AI labs, the companies building these huge large language models, they're running the co-paradigm right now regarding AI's impact on human labor.
Yes. The strategy is to hire the absolute top-tier, most credentialed experts to control the narrative around labor disruption.
To project an illusion of consensus.
Right. They want everyone to believe that AI is going to be this magical utopian engine of economic growth rather than, a brutal disruptor of middle-class jobs.
And the staffing moves we're seeing completely back this up. Just recently, OpenAI hired Dr. Ronnie Chatterjee.
Oh, yeah? The Duke professor.
Yeah, he served as the chief economist for the U.S. Department of Commerce. And then Anthropic, another major AI lab, literally formed a whole economic advisory council featuring 10 heavy-hitting economists.
From places like MIT and Harvard, right?
Exactly. And Google DeepMind brought on a University of Chicago economist to be their director of AGI economics.
It creates a perfectly closed loop of validation.
Explain what you mean by that.
Well, the very people who are supposed to be objectively analyzing the catastrophic risks of AI on the labor market, they are now on the payroll of the companies incentivized to deploy that AI as fast as possible.
It's like the fox guarding the henhouse, but the fox has a PhD. So how do we evaluate what is real and what is just corporate spin?
Acemoglu offers a really deeply pragmatic three-question framework to pierce through this kind of manufactured doubt.
Okay, let's hear the test.
First, you have to ask, who benefits if this specific claim is believed?
That makes sense. Basic incentive tracking.
Right. If a company says, our technology will boost global GDP by 7%, so don't regulate us, and that belief directly inflates their stock valuation, you immediately apply a massive discount to the claim.
Okay, what's the second question?
The second question is, who outside of the company and outside of their financial orbit has independently verified the work?
And this is critical when we look at the performance benchmarks these AI companies constantly brag about, right?
Oh, absolutely. This part of the research is fascinating.
Because we see the headlines all the time. ChatGPT passes the bar exam. Or, new AI model scores in the 90th percentile on the SATs.
It feels like we're on the verge of artificial general intelligence.
It really does. But the independent analysis in the sources suggests these tests are basically an illusion.
They are an illusion, mostly because of how the underlying technology actually works. Large language models are, at their core, incredibly sophisticated prediction engines.
They aren't actually thinking.
Right. They ingest trillions of words of human text, and they calculate the statistical probability of what the next word should be.
So when it passes the bar exam, it's not because it's reasoning like a lawyer in a courtroom.
Precisely. It's highly likely that the bar exam questions, or slight variations of them, were heavily represented in the massive data set the model was trained on.
So it's effectively an open book test.
It's rote memorization disguised as intelligence.
Okay, so how do you actually test for reasoning that? If we can't trust the SATs or the bar exam, what is the independent metric?
The sources highlight a specific independent benchmark called the ARC-AGI test.
ARC-AGI.
Yeah, it was developed by Francois Chalet, an AI researcher who wanted to test for actual novel reasoning. The ARC test doesn't use text at all.
Wait, no text? How does a language model take a test with no text?
It uses visual geometric grids. It shows the AI a few examples of a pattern transforming like colored blocks shifting or rotating based on some hidden rule, and then asks the AI to apply that rule to a new, unseen grid.
Oh, I've seen those. It's like those logic puzzles they give to kindergartners to test spatial awareness.
Exactly like that. And the key here is that these specific patterns do not exist anywhere on the internet.
Ah, so the AI cannot rely on its training data.
Exactly. It actually has to deduce the underlying logic in real time, and the results are staggering.
What are the scores?
Well, human beings easily score 100% on these tasks.
Yeah.
But the frontier models, the multi-billion-dollar systems from OpenAI and Google, they score below 1%.
Below 1%. Wow. That completely shatters the narrative of impending artificial superintelligence.
It really does. It shows that real-world AI deployment is actually going to be slow, partial, and highly specific, not some overnight utopian revolution.
And that leads to Acemoglu's third question. Is there a falsifiable prediction attached to the claim?
Right, the falsifiability test.
Because if an executive says AI will eliminate all human coding jobs in 5 years, that is unfalsifiable in the present moment.
It's fortune teller talk. It's designed to create hype and attract venture capital.
It creates this top-down narrative of technological utopia. But while the elites are gazing at this hypothetical AI future, the bottom-up economic reality is flashing bright red.
Let's talk about that reality. Let's look at the engine of the car.
Yeah, the source is referred to a specific data point called Chart 33, and this chart tracks the estimated percentage of 30-year-olds in the United States who have hit two specific traditional milestones of adulthood.
Being married and owning a home.
Right. And this chart is perhaps the starkest visualization of structural economic decline available right now. In 1950, over 50% of 30-year-olds had achieved both of those milestones.
Half the population.
They had formed a family, and they held the deed to a house. Today, that number has collapsed to less than 15%.
We really need to pause and examine the mechanics of that drop, from over half the population down to less than 15%.
It's huge.
That is not a cyclical fluctuation. That is not a minor recession. That represents a fundamental systemic shift in what the economy actually allows a young adult to achieve.
It makes me think of playing a city-building video game, like SimCity.
Oh, yeah, the SimCity fail state.
Exactly. Imagine you're the mayor and you spend all your time looking at the commercial district. The corporate skyscrapers are gleaming, the tax revenue from the mega corporations is high.
And if that's all you look at, you think you're winning the game.
Right, which is the equivalent of watching the S&P 500 hit all-time highs on CNBC. But then you scroll your camera over to the residential zones.
And they're a mess.
The houses are dilapidated, no new families are moving in, the infrastructure is crumbling, the city is actively failing, but the dashboard in the commercial zone says everything is perfect.
That is a highly accurate analogy.
Yeah.
And the economic data points to very specific, deliberate mechanisms driving this failure in the residential zone.
It comes down to structural shifts in corporate hiring practices and large-scale immigration policies, right?
Yes. We'll have to dig into those numbers from the sources because they are staggering. According to the data, when you look at the net job gains since the pre-COVID economic peak, a massive disparity emerges.
I was reading this part. 90% of the net job gains have gone to foreign-born workers.
Let's break down the sheer volume of those statistics to understand the friction it creates. Since 2020, the native-born workforce has gained fewer than 500,000 net jobs.
Okay.
But in that exact same time frame, the foreign-born workforce saw a net job gain of over 4.2 million.
Wait, let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around the mechanics of this. Are we saying that the domestic economy is generating jobs, but the native-born population is essentially being bypassed?
The data suggests a heavy bifurcation. You have an elite class of knowledge workers at the very top, and then you have a massive expansion of jobs at the middle and lower tiers.
And who's filling those?
Those middle and lower tier jobs are increasingly being filled by foreign-born labor pools.
So when the vast majority of new employment expansion entirely bypasses native-born 20-somethings, it directly correlates to that collapsing line on Chart 33.
Exactly. If you do not have steady, upwardly mobile employment, you simply cannot qualify for a mortgage, and you delay or abandon family formation.
But immigration isn't the only top-down mandate shifting the labor market. The research also details a massive shift engineered by corporate diversity metrics.
This is a huge piece of the puzzle.
Look at the data from the year immediately following the Black Lives Matter protests. The S&P 100, the top 100 companies in the market, they added over 300,000 jobs.
But the demographic breakdown of those hires is what's incredible.
Right. 94% of those net new jobs went to people of color.
This is where we have to unpack the mechanics of ESG, environmental, social, and governance scores.
Because this isn't just about a few companies independently deciding to change their hiring practices out of the goodness of their hearts.
No, not at all. This is about structural coercion from the top of the financial food chain. It comes down to asset managers. Firms like BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street.
They manage trillions of dollars.
Trillions of dollars in index funds.
Yeah.
And because they hold massive blocks of shares in virtually every publicly traded company, they have immense proxy voting power.
They can literally vote out corporate board members.
They can dictate access to cheap capital. So they essentially act as a cartel enforcing ideological metrics.
Wow. So over the last decade, these asset managers made high ESG scores a prerequisite for favorable investment.
Right. And a massive component of these social and governance pillars of ESG are strict demographic diversity targets.
So a CEO of an S&P 100 company is heavily incentivized to prioritize top-down demographic hiring metrics over traditional merit-based productivity.
If they don't, they risk a proxy fight from BlackRock, or they lose access to massive pools of investment capital.
It's an entirely engineered economy. The hiring isn't based on who is most qualified to increase the bottom line. It's based on fulfilling a spreadsheet metric demanded by a massive bank.
And when you fundamentally alter the traditional capitalist incentive structures, when you displace local workers through migration and enforce top-down demographic mandates, you begin cracking the economic foundation.
Which leads directly into the consequences of those cracks. Because when local workers are displaced and economic mobility stalls, it inevitably creates massive, unsustainable pressure on public resources.
And public spaces. It turns the local community into a pressure cooker. And as the sources show, that pressure is currently boiling over all around the world.
Let's pivot to the global pressure cooker and look at South Africa. The reports coming out of South Africa detail massive, ongoing anti-illegal immigration protests.
And this data completely shatters the typical narrative we are fed in the West.
Usually when the media covers an anti-immigration protest, they frame it heavily through a racial lens, right?
Always. Painting a picture of angry, right-wing white citizens protesting against non-white immigrants.
But the demographic reality of the friction in South Africa completely upends that framing. These protests are being driven by what the observers on the ground describe as black fatigue.
Exactly. These are native black South Africans organizing massive protests against immigrants arriving from Somalia, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, and the Congo.
We have to look at the groups organizing this. We are seeing grassroots, citizen-led organizations with names like March and Operation Dudula.
Doodle is a Zulu word, right?
Yeah, it roughly translates to push back or to force out. And these groups are mobilizing thousands of people to march through the streets of major urban centers like Pretoria and Johannesburg.
Their demands are explicit: mass deportations of undocumented foreigners and a strict prioritization of South African citizens for jobs, housing, and healthcare.
They aren't just holding signs either. They literally issued a public ultimatum demanding that undocumented foreigners leave the country by June 30th.
To understand the intensity of this friction, you have to look at the sheer economic strain on the ground there. South Africa is currently staggering under an official unemployment rate of around 32 to 33%.
33% unemployment. That is Depression-era numbers.
It is catastrophic. When a third of your entire working-age population cannot find employment, the competition for basic survival becomes fierce.
Public services have to be buckling.
Oh, the health clinics, the subsidized housing lists, the public schools, they're all collapsing under the weight of high inflows of economic migrants. The local citizens feel completely abandoned by their government.
So they're taking the enforcement of borders into their own hands.
Right, and the research highlights a fascinating philosophical clash happening within these protests.
This is about Ubuntu, right?
Yes. Historically, there is a deeply progressive, unifying Southern African philosophy known as Ubuntu. It loosely translates to, I am because we are.
It's a beautiful concept, emphasizing universal human bonds, hospitality, collective well-being.
But the leaders of these protests are actively, vocally rejecting the weaponization of Ubuntu.
Right, because when politicians or NGOs try to use the concept to guilt the protesters into accepting open borders, the protesters push back aggressively.
One of the movement leaders was quoted saying that Ubuntu does not mean you must allow people to enter the country illegally, set up shop, and exploit the economic freedom of the host nation while the citizens starve.
They are drawing a hard line between a philosophy of universal humanism and the practical physical reality of national survival.
They are arguing that you cannot have a borderless utopian philosophy in an environment of extreme resource scarcity.
And this brings us to a much broader issue explored in the research, the economic strain of specific immigrant populations, particularly regarding the systemic exploitation of welfare systems in host nations.
And the numbers provided regarding the United States are genuinely shocking.
Let's look at the data coming out of Minnesota. According to the demographic research, 81% of all Somali households in Minnesota are on some form of government welfare.
81%.
And if you narrow that down to Somali households with children, the welfare usage jumps to an astonishing 89%.
We need to contextualize that against the broader population. Native-born households in the same region sit at roughly 21% welfare usage.
That is a massive delta. And surely the counterargument is that new immigrants need a safety net when they first arrive, right? They need time to assimilate.
That is the standard assumption. But the research points out a critical anomaly.
Yeah.
This extreme rate of welfare reliance remains relatively static even after these families have been in the United States for 10 years.
So it is not acting as a temporary bridge.
No, it is functioning as a permanent economic strategy.
But wait, Here is the real paradox in the data. The reports also show that the average reported income for Somali households in the U.S. is roughly $70,000 to $80,000 a year.
Which is solidly middle class.
Right. Let's walk through the mechanics of this. How is it mathematically possible for a demographic group to have a middle-class reported income while simultaneously 90% of the families with children are drawing government welfare?
Because those programs are means tested.
Exactly. If you make $80,000, you shouldn't qualify for the safety net.
The research argues that this statistical impossibility points directly toward systemic, deeply entrenched ethnic cartel fraud.
Cartel fraud. How does that actually operate on the ground? We aren't talking about a few people lying on a food stamp application.
No, we're talking about highly organized, large-scale schemes designed to bleed institutional safety nets. The research points to the systemic exploitation of programs like Medicaid billing, subsidized daycare, and autism therapy services.
Walk me through the daycare fraud as an example of the mechanics.
Okay, so an organized group will open a state-licensed daycare facility. They will then recruit families within their specific ethnic network to register their children for the state's subsidized child care program.
So the state pays the daycare center directly to watch the kids.
Exactly. The state pays the maximum daily rate for hundreds of children. The catch is, the children never actually attend the daycare.
Wait, really?
It's a ghost facility. The operators of the facility collect millions in state subsidies. They kick back a portion of the cash to the parents who provided the children's social security numbers, and they funnel the rest through shell companies or wire it overseas.
It's a closed-loop system of theft.
And it is happening at a staggering scale.
Oh.
The research broadens this out to look at California, which is currently facing a total crisis regarding organized fraud against its social safety nets.
I saw this number. The estimates cited in the reports put the fraud in California at roughly $280 billion.
$280 billion.
I want you, the listener, to really comprehend the scale of that number. The research notes that $280 billion completely dwarfs the entire gross domestic product of the country of Qatar.
Yes. Think about that.
The systemic fraud in a single U.S. state is larger than the entire economic output of one of the wealthiest oil nations in the Middle East. It is unfathomable.
When fraud operates on a scale that rivals national GDPs, it is no longer just a criminal issue. It is a systemic bleeding of the society's foundation.
And when public resources are drained to this degree and local citizens feel the burden of taxation without the benefit of public order, the fundamental concept of a high-trust society begins to collapse.
Which brings us to the physical breakdown of public spaces. Because the collapse of trust doesn't just happen on a spreadsheet. It happens in our streets and our commercial centers.
The research delves heavily into the phenomenon of teen takeovers.
We've all seen the viral footage of these events over the last few years.
Absolutely. Flash mob-style riots erupting in major urban centers. Chicago, Tampa, Washington, D.C. We are talking about hundreds, sometimes thousands of youths coordinating on social media, descending on a downtown area or a shopping mall, and just unleashing chaos.
Jumping on police cars, smashing storefronts, violently assaulting pedestrians.
And completely overwhelming local law enforcement's capacity to respond.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the breakdown of public order. But what is equally fascinating is how the research analyzes the media and institutional response to these events.
The euphemisms.
Precisely. The research impartially points out that the mainstream media heavily relies on rhetorical deflection when covering these riots.
Right, like when major retail malls are forced to permanently shutter because they can no longer guarantee the physical safety of their shoppers.
The financial press will often attribute the closure to changing consumer habits or the rise of e-commerce,
rather than admitting that organized retail theft and mob violence made the property uninsurable.
Yes. And when covering the riots themselves, the media consistently refers to the perpetrators simply as youths or teens.
The research argues this is a deliberate strategy to avoid discussing the specific demographic realities of these coordinated crime waves, because the raw video evidence clearly shows they are predominantly driven by minority youth.
And this institutional refusal to acknowledge reality goes far beyond media euphemisms. It is actively changing how cities govern themselves and enforce the law.
The research highlights a specific, incredibly revealing city council meeting in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
This incident perfectly encapsulates the institutional paralysis we were discussing.
So Cambridge had previously installed a technology called ShotSpotter For our listeners who might not be familiar with the mechanics of it, ShotSpotter is an array of acoustic sensors, essentially high-tech microphones placed on utility poles around a city.
Right.
When a gun is fired, the microphones detect the acoustic signature of the gunshot. By measuring the slight delay in the sound reaching different microphones, the software instantly triangulates the exact location of the gunfire.
And then it dispatches police to that precise GPS coordinate within seconds.
It is a purely objective technological tool. A microphone does not have racial bias, it does not profile. It simply registers the sound of an explosion and locates it, with the explicit goal of saving the lives of gunshot victims in high-crime areas by drastically reducing police response times.
But the Cambridge City Council held a vote, and they actively chose to dismantle and disable the ShotSpotter network.
And the rationale for disabling it is where ideology completely overrides public safety. Progressive activists and council members argue that the technology was inherently racist.
Why? Because the microphones disproportionately recorded gunshots in minority neighborhoods.
Because that is where the gun violence was statistically occurring.
Exactly. But the activists argue that this objective data led to the over-policing of Black and brown communities.
Let me make sure I'm following the logic here. A community is suffering from a higher rate of gun violence. The city installs a tool to pinpoint that violence and save victims. But because the tool reveals uncomfortable demographic statistics about where the violence is localized, the city's solution is to turn off the microphones and pretend the violence isn't happening.
That is exactly the mechanism at play. And it is entirely rooted in a legal and cultural framework known as the disparate impact doctrine.
The research dives deep into this doctrine. Explain how disparate impact actually works, because it seems to be the engine driving this entire institutional response.
The doctrine stems from a landmark 1971 Supreme Court case, Griggs v. Duke Power. Before this case, racial discrimination was defined as intentional malicious bias.
Okay, that makes sense.
But the disparate impact doctrine changed the definition entirely. It essentially established that a law, a policy, or even an employment test is legally discriminatory if it results in unequal statistical outcomes for different racial groups.
Regardless of whether there was any discriminatory intent.
Yes. So even if a policy is completely colorblind in its application, like a microphone listening for a gunshot, if the outcome of that policy affects one demographic more than another, the policy itself is deemed impermissible.
It effectively makes objective standards illegal if the reality of human behavior doesn't produce perfectly equitable statistical results.
Exactly.
I have to push back on the viability of this for a society. If a community actively dismantles the very tools used to track and stop violent crime, simply to avoid generating politically inconvenient data, aren't they just guaranteeing the destruction of that community?
They absolutely are.
Because the law-abiding citizens living in those neighborhoods, regardless of their race, aren't going to stick around for a sociological experiment. They are going to flee.
The research outlines the inevitable cascade of this ideological governance. When a system refuses to enforce basic laws or objective standards, it inherently creates a two-tier justice system.
It destroys a high-trust society.
The immediate result is capital flight. Businesses close and refuse to invest. Then comes white flight and middle-class flight. Anyone with the financial means to leave the chaos will relocate to a safer jurisdiction.
Which leaves the most vulnerable citizens trapped in a collapsing infrastructure, devoid of safe, shared third spaces.
We are already seeing the death of the third space. Malls and entertainment districts across the country are implementing curfews and banning unaccompanied minors entirely, simply to maintain basic order.
But the collateral damage of this environment isn't just economic, and it isn't just geographic. When you systematically strip a society of its economic mobility, its public safety, and its objective truth, the resulting damage is profoundly psychological.
And it is completely rewiring the minds of the incoming generation.
Which brings us to the data on the psychological toll. We are looking at a generation that is completely adrift.
The demographic surveys provided in the research paint a harrowing picture of a massive crisis of meaning.
They show a total collapse in the foundational values that have historically anchored human societies. If you look at the tracking polls over the last 25 years, the percentage of people who say that concepts like patriotism, religion, having children, and community involvement are very important to them has plummeted.
It's falling off a cliff.
Yeah.
All the transcendent markers of meaning, faith, legacy, local community, they're dissolving.
And according to the data, what is the only value that has actively risen in importance since 1998?
Money.
Money. When a culture dismantles the transcendent and the local, it replaces it with the purely material and the digital. And the psychological results of that replacement are devastating.
And the research reveals a fascinating, though deeply concerning, correlation regarding this mental health crisis. It turns out that psychological distress heavily correlates with political ideology.
Let's look at the raw numbers on this. Over 50% of young liberal women report having been diagnosed by a medical professional with a mental health condition.
50%, 1 in 2.
Compare that to the other side of the spectrum. Roughly 15% of young women who identify as strong Republicans report a similar diagnosis. Why is there such a massive structural gap in psychological resilience between these two worldviews?
To explain the mechanics of this, the research introduces a psychological framework called the concern heat map.
Let's unpack this heat map because it is crucial.
Imagine a target with concentric circles. The center dot is yourself. The first ring is your immediate family. The next ring is your local community, your neighbors.
Okay.
And as you move further out, the rings represent strangers, distant nations, and global abstract issues. Historically and biologically, human beings are wired to allocate their emotional heat, their highest levels of acute concern and anxiety, to the innermost circles.
Which makes perfect evolutionary sense. If my house is on fire, I have to care about that more than a political scandal happening 10,000 miles away.
Right.
If my child is sick, that takes total emotional precedence over abstract global warming models. It is the natural triage of human empathy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The conservative heat map still broadly reflects this traditional localized alignment. But the research argues that the heat map for modern liberals has been entirely inverted by ideological conditioning.
How so? Explain the inversion.
They are heavily socialized to allocate their highest levels of moral concern and emotional anxiety to the outermost circle's distant global conflicts, abstract systemic injustices, climate apocalypse, the perceived struggles of strangers.
Meanwhile, they reserve far less active concern for their own immediate circles, marriage, child-rearing, and local community building. If we look at this analytically, it explains the mental health collapse perfectly. Empathy is a finite resource.
Yes, it is.
If you train a generation to constantly project their maximum emotional heat outward onto vast, complex global issues that they have zero actual power to control or fix, you are mathematically guaranteeing chronic anxiety and depression.
They're perpetually carrying the weight of the world while simultaneously abandoning the very local, tangible structures like family and faith that would actually give them the resilience to bear it.
And this psychological vulnerability is heavily compounded by the institutions themselves, which actively use moral panic to enforce ideological compliance. The research highlights a highly disturbing example of this institutional gaslighting during a recent debate at the Cambridge Union.
Let's talk about the Cambridge Union debate, because this illustrates the weaponization of empathy perfectly.
So a university student stood up to debate against radical transgender ideology. She specifically cited the real-world consequences of organizations like Stonewall.
She pointed out that these organizations produce school guidance that literally instructs young children on how to tightly bind their developing breasts and how to secretly source cross-sex hormones online.
Explicitly advising them to do this behind their parents' backs.
Right. She is raising a fundamental mechanical safeguarding concern. She is pointing out that institutions are actively coaching minors to deceive their parents regarding life-altering medical interventions.
That should be a universally alarming observation. So how did the opposition respond to her argument?
They did not address the mechanics of the safeguarding issue at all. Instead, a member of the opposition stood up and passionately declared that anyone in the room who voted with the student, anyone who agreed with her concerns, would have blood dripping down their hands.
Blood dripping down their hands. Let's analyze the rhetorical mechanism there. If you ask a basic question about the medicalization of children, you are immediately accused of murder. You are a monster driving children to suicide.
It is a form of aggressive language policing designed to enforce total consensus through moral terror.
Right, because when elite institutions characterize the basic protection of children or the questioning of novel medical interventions as literal acts of violence, it forces reasonable people into silence.
It creates an environment of profound moral confusion and paralysis.
And we are seeing the exact results of that paralysis in the broader personality data of young adults. The demographic surveys show a literal free fall in what psychologists classify as conscientiousness and extroversion.
And the young adults are self-reporting this, right?
Yes. They are stating that they are increasingly careless, they are easily distracted, they feel fundamentally incapable of making a basic life plan, and following through with it.
They are completely paralyzed by the sheer weight of the inverted concern heat map and the institutional gaslighting. And as a result, their definitions of what constitutes a successful life have been completely hollowed out.
The data on this is heartbreaking. The research cites a massive polling study comparing what different demographics consider the #1 marker of a successful life.
Let's hear the comparison.
For men who voted for Donald Trump, they ranked having children and raising a family as our highest priority, the ultimate marker of success.
And when you look at the cohort of women who voted for Kamala Harris, they ranked having children dead last on the list of what makes a life meaningful.
It is a total inversion of biological and historical norms. Okay, let's take a deep breath. We have covered a massive amount of incredibly heavy ground. If this top-down engineering, the AI hype, the mass displacement, the collapse of public spaces, and the weaponized empathy has resulted in a generation that is lonely, anxious, heavily medicated, and stripped of the ability to even follow through on a plan.
Where is the escape hatch?
Exactly. How do we stop staring at the broken dashboard and actually fix the engine?
This is where the research pivots brilliantly. It moves away from analyzing the macro-level rot and offers a deeply traditional, hyper-local solution.
It suggests that the answer isn't a new political party or a top-down federal policy. The answer is the productive household.
I found this concept from Adam Madden absolutely fascinating. The productive household. He is essentially calling for a total rejection of the dismantled, outsourced lifestyle that was handed to us by the industrial and digital revolutions.
To understand Madden's point, we have to look at the historical mechanics of the family unit. For thousands of years, the household was the undisputed center of human life.
It wasn't just a place where you slept.
Right. It was the center of economic production, education, healthcare, and spiritual formation. The family worked together physically to survive and thrive.
But the Industrial Revolution fractured that model. It pulled the father out of the household and sent him to the factory for 10 hours a day.
It outsourced economic production. Then, the mid-20th century outsourced education and elder care to the state. And finally, the digital revolution fractured whatever was left, isolating every member of the family into separate rooms, staring at their own individual glowing screens.
Madden argues that we have to aggressively reverse this. We must leverage modern economic tools like remote work, digital entrepreneurship, or hyperlocal trades to actively bring the family back together in physical space.
We have to make the household economically and spiritually productive again.
And the research ties this practical advice to some very deep, ancient theological grounding. It points to St. Augustine's framework of the city of God versus the city of man.
Let's explore that framing because it completely changes the scale of what we are dealing with.
Augustine wrote this after the sack of Rome, when the greatest top-down empire in the world was collapsing. He argued that human history isn't just a series of political squabbles. It is a cosmic, enduring battle between two distinct seeds, dating all the way back to Genesis.
The city of man is built on self-love, materialism, the pursuit of earthly power, and top-down coercion. It is destined to eventually rot and fall, much like the economic and institutional systems we've analyzed today.
While the city of God is built on the love of God, transcendent truth, and enduring spiritual reality.
Yes. And the critical takeaway is that the solution to a failing city of man is not to try and aggressively conquer it using its own corrupt, coercive tools. The solution is to faithfully, radically build out outposts of the city of God, locally, within your own household and community.
And building that outpost requires a relentless commitment to reclaiming physical reality. The research gets very specific here and honestly a bit jarring for the modern ear.
It advocates for a return to deeply tangible, traditional customs to reground us in the physical stakes of life and death.
For example, it discusses the modern outsourcing of death.
Right. Historically, when a family member died, the family washed the body, they held the wake in their own living room. The men of the community physically dug the grave in the local churchyard. You were intimately connected to the physical reality of mortality.
Today, the moment someone passes, a sterile corporate entity arrives, takes the body away, handles all the chemicals, and presents a highly manicured experience weeks later.
The argument is that by outsourcing every difficult, messy human experience to a corporate third party, we have profoundly stripped ourselves of our humanity and our resilience. We have become alienated from the physical world.
The research also touches on how this alienation affects our relationship with the spiritual world. It cites warnings from ancient Orthodox theology, regarding the modern obsession with the paranormal.
Yes, the cultural trend of treating the spiritual realm as entertainment. The ghost hunts, the seances, the casual dabbling in the occult.
The Orthodox tradition warns that this is incredibly hubristic and spiritually dangerous. You don't treat the unseen world like a carnival ride.
Instead of seeking out adrenaline spikes through the paranormal, the tradition advises practicing the ancient prayer of the heart, a constant, grounding, humble repetition, seeking spiritual safety and internal quiet.
It is all about shifting away from modern, manufactured stimulation and returning to ancient, localized grounding. Which brings us to the most profound metaphor in the entire stack of research, the naming the cow study.
I know it sounds almost comical to bring up a dairy farming study after discussing Augustine and Orthodox theology, but the mechanics of this study perfectly encapsulate everything we've talked about today.
It truly does. Break down the data on the cows.
Okay, so researchers looked at commercial dairy operations. They found that if you have a dairy cow and you leave it unnamed, if you just tag it with a serial number, leave it in a massive industrial herd and treat it purely as a biological machine for extracting milk, that cow produces an average of about 7.6 liters of milk.
It produces a baseline stressed yield.
But if a farmer simply gives that exact same cow a name and treats it with individual care, speaks to it, treats it like a member of the farm ecosystem rather than a factory widget, the physiological stress levels of the animal drop.
And as a result, its milk yield nearly doubles.
If we connect the mechanics of this study to the broader human picture we've painted today, the parallel is exact. Human beings are mammals. We are deeply responsive to our environment.
We utterly wither and break down when we are treated as mere economic cogs in a globalized labor pool.
Or as diversity metrics in an ESG spreadsheet, or as data points to be mined by a tech company's algorithm. When the elite systems treat us like unnamed cattle, the society produces depression, friction, and collapse.
To thrive, we require genuine, localized physical care. We need to be named. We need the productive household.
The research reinforces this by pointing to the ancient biblical mandate found in Deuteronomy 6. It commands parents to teach their children constantly to integrate moral and spiritual formation into every aspect of daily life.
Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up.
But let's look at the mechanical friction here. To actually execute the mandate of Deuteronomy 6, you need one critical resource: actual time. You need massive amounts of physical time with your children.
And the modern two-income, 60-hour corporate commute completely destroys that time.
It annihilates it. You cannot successfully cram ancient, slow, deeply rooted values into a fragmented, exhausted, modern schedule. The two systems are incompatible.
Okay, I have to challenge this because I am putting myself in the shoes of someone listening right now.
Let's hear it.
It sounds beautiful and poetic to talk about building a productive household, integrating your family, ditching the corporate grind, and spending all day walking along the road with your kids.
Yeah.
But for a listener who is trapped in a 9-to-5 job, sitting in 2 hours of traffic every day just trying to pay for massively overpriced groceries and keep the lights on, how is this actually attainable without already being independently wealthy? It sounds like a luxury for the rich.
That is the most important pushback. And the source material addresses the mechanics of this transition directly. It requires a fundamental shift in mindset, the embrace of total inconvenience.
Meaning what, exactly?
It is not about quitting your job on a Tuesday and buying a farm. It is a process of brutal, incremental alignment.
How does that look in practice?
You have to sit down and ruthlessly audit your life. You look at the reality of your schedule, your finances, and your family dynamic, and you admit that things are deeply out of order. Let's say you identify 45 things that are misaligned with building a productive household.
You don't try to fix all 45 things at once. That leads to paralysis.
Exactly. You pick the single most important one. Maybe it's cutting out 3 hours of television to learn a skill that allows you to work remotely 1 day a week. Maybe it's drastically downsizing your lifestyle to transition from 2 incomes to 1.5.
You pick one thing, you make a faithful mathematical plan to fix it, and you execute. And then you move to the next.
It is the slow, grinding work of taking back your autonomy. And as you do this, the research notes that you cannot do it in complete isolation. You need a community that won't judge you for questioning the mainstream narrative.
Which is why the sources strongly suggest creating what they call estuary groups.
Estuary groups. Explain the concept of an estuary in this context.
In nature, an estuary is the place where the fresh water of a river meets the salt water of the ocean. It is a transition zone, incredibly fertile, but inherently turbulent.
Okay, so culturally, what is it?
In a cultural context, an estuary group is a safe, big tent physical space, often outside the formal, highly managed structure of a Sunday morning church service or a corporate boardroom.
It's a living room, a backyard fire pit.
Exactly. It is a space where people can gather locally to discuss messy historical truths, theological doubts, political realities, and cultural observations without the terror of immediate institutional backlash, HR reporting, or being socially canceled.
It is the incubator where the local community figures out how to survive the collapse of the top-down systems.
So let's thread the needle of this entire deep dive. We are living through a profound historical era where the elite top-down systems are actively failing to deliver on their promises.
We have looked at the manufactured hype of the AI labs trying to control the labor narrative. We've seen the disastrous reality of global migration policies and ESG mandates displacing local workers and straining public resources to the breaking point.
We've examined the astronomical scale of institutional fraud, the collapse of high-trust public spaces, and the deeply engineered psychological misery of a generation forced to care about everything except their own backyards.
The central thesis of all this research is that these top-down models are utterly incapable of delivering human flourishing. They are producing the exact opposite.
Which means the true rebellion of our age is not going to be found in voting for a new federal policy, or engaging to abstract global debates, or posting the correct hashtag.
The true rebellion is found in the intensely local, the fiercely traditional, and the deeply committed physical family.
So we want to leave you with some highly practical, actionable takeaways based on the mechanics we've discussed today. The morning roundup action steps.
Number 1, audit your inputs. Tomorrow morning, when you read a headline or hear a corporate narrative, apply the co-paradigm test.
Ask yourself the fundamental mechanics. Who financially or politically benefits from me believing this narrative? And has this specific claim been objectively verified by someone entirely outside of the system pushing it?
Stop blindly trusting the dashboard.
Number 2, reclaim your household. Take one incremental, painful step to restructure your time today. Find 30 uninterrupted minutes to be physically actively present with your family or your local community.
Do not bring a screen. Actively, aggressively push back against the digital fragmentation of your attention.
And number 3, name your cow. Look at your life, your workplace, or your neighborhood, and identify one area where you've been treating a person, a relationship, or even a local process like a sterile machine.
Stop outsourcing your humanity. Inject genuine, physical, localized care into that relationship and watch the yield transform.
It is the only way to rebuild from the bottom up.
I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought to ponder as you go about your day. We looked at the hard data today, showing that traditional family structures, specifically the presence of married mothers and intact households, objectively yield the highest possible rates of human happiness, economic stability, and psychological resilience.
If the data is that clear, we have to ask a hard question.
Is our modern culture's relentless, celebrated pursuit of liberation from those traditional norms actually just a highly sophisticated, engineered form of self-sabotage?
It is a question that challenges the entire foundation of the modern social experiment.
Think about that dashboard we talked about at the beginning. If the gauges are telling you that you are making incredible progress, but the engine is actively on fire and you are running out of gas, maybe it is finally time to stop trusting the institutions telling you to keep your foot firmly on the accelerator.
We highly encourage you to check the show notes for links to all the original white papers, economic charts, and theological essays we've analyzed today.
Go explore these sources deeper, look at the mechanics for yourself, and decide where you stand. Thank you for joining us on this morning roundup deep dive. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share the show with someone who needs to hear it. We'll see you next time.